Hong Kong has a unique situation, and that's transit system is also its developer. Do you think other cities can learn from this model? And how does that help or hinder in any way development or alter it in Hong Kong?
Yeah, this is actually something we are particularly interested in as a firm. We've been involved in this transport-oriented development for many years. We started in the UK, where we looked at air ride buildings above Charing Cross Station. That was our first sort of air ride project, and then we went to Hong Kong and did Kowloon development. And we became very much a fan of integrating transport with density. And we believe that cities, to maximize their growth potential, the transport system and the developments have to merge into each other. And in Hong Kong, that's been taken to the extreme. We have done this case study where we compare London with Hong Kong. London and Hong Kong actually have similar amount of land take, and they have similar population. But in Hong Kong, you have 75% countryside, and in London, you have very little, just some parks. So that density, we think, is very sustainable. It makes a very good living. I've been there for 20 years. I enjoy the leisure part of Hong Kong, the beaches, the water activities. But when you are in the city, everything is super convenient. You are within reach to any activity you wanna have. So I think it's a very sustainable way to grow a city.
That seems like there's probably lots of reasons why London and Hong Kong have that different level of density, but some of it might have to do with Hong Kong's development being more recent, a lot of it, right? Or is there, I guess the question I'd like to ask would be, for a city like London,
yes,
is it possible to retrofit in that sense with green space and densify going forward, or is this something where we have to basically start from scratch, or is it more difficult?
Okay, I mean, Hong Kong was, the densities was really largely driven by the topography of Hong Kong, because it had to develop along the waterfront. There are mountains there, and then there were these layers of reclamation, and each time there was a layer, there was a new level of density. So it was inherent to the topography of Hong Kong. London has just a number of villages grew together into a big pot. And that cannot really be reversed. But what's happening in London now is there's a huge demand for new homes, and now there's a heavy debate as to whether these homes should be outside the center of the city, or whether there are opportunities to find new places within the city. And in fact, what we are pioneering there and exploring there is to bring this experience from Hong Kong back to London. There are railway. There's railway land which is now kind of residual pieces of land. Hasn't really been explored how that could be developed, like Old Common, for example. And where you have these big railway fans, the high-speed railway will go through there, but literally no access to the piece of land. It's a triangular piece, very large. You can't get there. So we were propagating to develop over the top of the railway there. So a little bit like what's been happening in Hong Kong, and I think what's happening more now in China as well.
Right.
So this idea of merging transport and development, I think, is very relevant anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I see that transport and sort of saving land for parks and leisure space and natural areas as maybe two elements of this, and you've already mentioned them. But what sort of things do you think tall building designers, developers can do to make tall building developments more sympathetic to the human scale?
Right. Now, I think there's maybe a little bit of a perception of what is good for humans. I feel one of the biggest challenges with towers is that they are quite often built in isolation. I feel Pudong is a little bit of an example. It's getting a little bit better, but essentially these individual lots have been allocated for towers, and some of them may be very tall, but there's no streetscape. Yeah. There's no experience for people to walk around. Even when you want to walk from the Qingmao building somewhere, you don't actually know where to go. There is no real attraction other than maybe the Sanggong-kai development now next door. So I'm a very strong believer that towers should be integrated into mixed-use developments. So you should have some framework to hold all these towers together. Doesn't have to be a podium necessarily, but some sort of groundscape which gives a human scale and gives opportunities for people to enjoy the streetscape. I'm also very, very much of a believer that the streetscape should be given over to the people, not to the cars.
Yeah.
Of course, cars and people can mix, but there should be a very active environment for people where they can look at shops, sit in cafes. They must take charge of their environment. So I think this gradation, you have a groundscape, which is essentially a people space. And there could be different programs to the people space. One is kind of a public realm, where people can go and buy stuff or to go to restaurants. But there also is opportunities with the introduction of a podium or podium-like structure. There is an opportunity to also create a semi-public space. So when there are people living above, say, for example, in towers, they can make use of the top of the podium as their private garden. So I think this layering principle, trying to find a way to integrate the bottom of the towers into an urban framework, I think is key.
So we talked about some of the things that Hong Kong is doing right in terms of sustainable development and densification. What are some of the main challenges for Hong Kong going forward, especially as it pertains to tall building design and development?
Now, Hong Kong is a fairly saturated city. I think now the urban areas became so dense that the growth potential there is actually reduced. So now the government is looking to develop the hinterland. And the strategy initially adopted for that was quite interesting. They were putting actually this, maybe a little bit the reverse to what you would expect. They were putting the railway systems in first. And they used the stations as catalysts for the new development. But there is obviously a bit of a timing factor there. How quickly can that new neighborhood grow? Some of the stations are now maybe a little bit underutilized because the development didn't occur quite as fast as one would have hoped. And also, Hong Kong is this kind of city where most people really want to be right in the heart of the city. So when you create these suburbs, you also create sort of a multinodal city that undermines a little bit the principle of the density and the linear nature of the city, which it had to start with. So that's maybe a little bit of a challenge. Also, the other challenge in Hong Kong, I guess, is pretty much an ignorance, or no, ignorance is not the right word,
Aversion?
There is basically no respect for history, right? Now there's a little bit of an intent to try to retain some of the older parts of the city, but actually all the urban fabric of how the city was like maybe 50 years ago, that's gone. And that's also a shame, I think, is part of the history of the city, and it, and these kind of, I think, it was a colonial city at the time, but these colonial structures and that special streetscape and the shop houses and all of that's literally vanished.
To that point, we're going to ask a few people, and I'd like to ask you how China and its cities, or any city around the world, can avoid or should be taking steps to avoid looking homogenous. How all of our skylines are becoming similar, it seems, at a rapid pace.
I must say I've been also thinking about that quite a bit. Because on one hand I very much believe in this transport-oriented development strategy, but on the other hand, does that get applied to the whole city, and you end up with this very monotonous model? I think cities live from their variety for sure, and there's also I think over time the attitude towards development kind of changes, and that results in maybe different city fabrics, I feel. Like one interesting example is Shenzhen. I'm quite fascinated by Shenzhen because it was a planned city. It grew at an immense rate, but in a very planned fashion, and they're creating all these different CBDs. And that's what I think is quite interesting. I mean, obviously people also want to have like a countryside, I think, and people still want to have a little house and a garden and that
Sure.
so you always get slightly less urban areas, more rural areas and more downtown areas. But what is interesting about Shenzhen is that these CBDs have been generated one after the other, just because of the growth, but as a planned, structured principle, right? First was the old area, Luobu, and then there was Futian, which is sort of a very grand new CBD. You have this big green spine, and the towers are flanking the green spine. Little bit, and there's a big kind of pedestrian network underneath which connects it. So there was some strategy for how you connect it, and then there was Nanyu, which was again another kind of system to connect these different neighborhoods. And now the latest endeavor is an area called Shanghai. I don't know whether you've heard of Shanghai.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, there's certainly. I think I just wrote about a project by Getch Partners there.
Right.
Anyway, there's a lot of everyone's.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah. No, I
of
think
development.
that's probably not new what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Shanghai, there's a new district being now created on the very western tip of Shenzhen.
Yes.
And there's about 1 million people going there.
Right.
We actually have the first project there, as it happens,
Okay.
Shanghai #1. And there was a new, I think all these lessons, some of these things I've been talking about, I think they were kind of trying to combine them. There is a very strong, it's on the waterfront, a very strong integration with landscape and water and development, which I think is a great thing. They've got all these landscape fingers, water fingers, which stretch into the bay. So the bay is kind of segmented in a number of quarters. They have like one quarter a bit more focused on culture, one quarter a bit more focused on living, but all is mixed use, and then one quarter a bit more focused on financial and businesses. And so already a master planning strategy which sets some principles and creates different characters. I think that will be interesting for the people.
Right.
And also the integration with transport was taken very seriously because it's a new start. It's kind of reclaimed land, most of it.
Right.
So they're not really building on any existing structures there, and they used these different models of transport integration. Some of them they're developing directly over the stations, and there's a number of towers there, and some of them. That's kind of the project we're working on. It's the towers have only very small retail pods at the bottom, individual retail pods at the bottom of the tower, which means you get a streetscape, a ground level streetscape for people to walk along, but rather than just seeing the bottom of the tower, they have that activated, right? With all sorts of different opportunities, restaurants and shops, and I think, and also in our scheme, there's also a basement connectivity to all the neighborhoods, which is in this part of the world, in Hong Kong and in Shenzhen, quite important because it's so humid there.
Yeah.
So in the summer it gets really hot. People don't really want to be outside that much. But in the shoulder season, it's nice to be outside.
Right.
So you want to provide that all. And then it also has an elevated network. So you've got these various connectivities to the surrounding and within the development, and it's still a very active, people-friendly space.
Right, because the cars have the street level maybe, and then the pedestrian levels below ground and above grade.
No, also at grade.
Grade.
And at grade. So actually, the way it works in this particular development, the cars are to either side. There's sort of main routes for the cars. So because you also need access.
Right.
You can't segregate people and vehicles totally from each other. You have trucks they drive at ground. You have buses. You have cars. You have taxis. You have drop-offs. So the buildings need both sides. They need that transport side, but they also need the people side. So in this case, we've got this. There's a sort of a people spine going between the towers, and then the towers are kind of set to either side of that spine, and then on the outside is where the vehicular systems are. There's even a small road going through the center, but I think that's fine. We in our cities are for all of us. So all the modes have to kind of be integrated with each other and complement each other. You just don't want one mode to totally overtake the function of the district. So coming back to this density issue, I I think towers offer different opportunities. There are different models for how to integrate them, and that ultimately will also result in different neighborhoods. And I think that's important for a city. It must have variety. That makes it interesting.
That's the character of the city.
I think that's the character of the city. And the more I think you want to build also on what's there. You don't want to kind of ignore it all and then just redevelop and lose the character. I think Singapore also does that quite well, actually.
Preservation, preserving character.
Yeah, I think so. I think they have real districts still of these shop houses, which is really nice to walk through. But then they also have the fairly new developed areas. The only challenge there is, from my point of view, they also try to integrate the transport with the developments, but they keep all the transport in the road, so it's really only kind of edits. We call it edits, links to the developments. Not quite so strong. And the other big issue is most of their developments are single use. So they have a big lot with residential, and then they have a big lot with office. And that's not really that good, because you don't activate the neighborhood. You have one is busy at one time of the day and the other one is busy at another time. I don't think that's right. It should be mixed use.
24-hour community.
That's right, exactly.
Another fun question we're asking everyone, or a lot of people today, is what height, or actually where will the world's tallest building be in 2050? And
2050?
You could pick a city, a country, a region.
Okay, I have to also think a little bit about that. I feel the reason why we build towers is multifaceted, right? In China, there's definitely a huge amount of population, and there's a demand for growth. I don't think that the way towers are built here are quite. There's not the main objective somehow, it feels. It is getting there, but I think it was also a lot of status symbol and trying to be taller. But there was definitely a requirement as the people from the countryside were moving towards the city. I would suggest if that is the reason, the huge amounts of population and densification of cities, which really should be ultimately where towers come from, then I would guess places like India and like maybe Indonesia. It's happening in Indonesia already to a degree. India, I think, is really just only starting.
Yeah. Why is that? India seems to not have nearly the level of tall building development. Not sure if you've worked.
I did work in India.
Comment on that, but.
I did work in India. It was a bit of a nightmare. We did again a transport-oriented development there in New Delhi, which is right in the heart of the big. It's not the biggest city, but it's the capital city, right?
Right.
So it was interesting. It was phenomenal. I really enjoyed it. And our master plan was trying to bring these different neighborhoods together in a station city in the city, and then there was a big development. Not so many towers, mainly low rise, to keep in line with all the other developments which were around there. But it was meant to be a 40 weeks project to determine the concept. We would not necessarily do all the execution. They wanted to get a developer in to do the financing. And I think we've worked on it for 5 years, and it's still no end in sight. And I think one of the problems is the bureaucracy in India. They're really worried about corruption, and they're really worried about giving unfair advantage, and that undermines any progress. That worry is so overtaking any decision making that you just cannot finish anything. Like, for example, in our project, it was quite big, 86 hectare. We were designing the station and everything else. I mean, a big station and a very big development. And then almost towards what we thought would be the kind of the final stages of the development, the client determined that there were actually mosques and there were religious structures and temples, and they had to be retained.
Right.
And there were like 30 or 40, and they were scattered all over the site, and they were right in the middle of the platforms of the station.
Right.
No, they have to stay. They couldn't politically justify
Yeah.
to move them, or even to move them and move them back.
Yeah.
And that's just a small example, but it kind of undermines any kind of real progress.
Almost too careful, if that's possible.
Too careful, I guess. Yeah, no,
If possible.
it's too. It's just this. I think any development you do, any big project, will always have supporters, and it will always have people who have some doubts, or who have some who challenge the project in some way. And if you always want to satisfy everyone, you can never achieve anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening in India.
We only have a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you what some uses of tall buildings that you feel might have been underexplored or completely unexplored to date. You sort of got into this earlier, saying mixed use, true vertical communities, or areas that integrate transit in a new way. But what are some uses of tall buildings that you feel have been underexplored to date?
I feel that they're obviously stacking functions above each other is to a degree challenging, because the typologies of uses are so different. I mean, offices, you want to have just big, open, unobstructed space. Flats, you usually have small units. Hotel rooms are fairly compatible with office, I feel, because it's also modular. Do you need to have vertical? I think it's good to have the functions vertically stacked, as long as it doesn't compromise the functionality of the building too much. What hasn't been done so much, I think retail, for example, hasn't really been kind of stacked in a big fashion into a tower. They've tried it in Hong Kong. There's a building called the Mega Box, which has 15-story retail. It's not really a tower, but it's at the bottom of the tower, and it's kind of really stacked up. And then to compensate that challenge of having so many levels, they had car parks on different zones, so you can actually drive up. But the whole thing becomes so convoluted and challenged. It doesn't really work. So I think some functions, like commercial and retail functions, doesn't really belong into the tower. It belongs at grade, because I think people belong at grade ultimately.
Right.
I think you can in a tower you can have some breakout spaces and spaces which people can enjoy and which are exciting, but they are of a particular nature and a particular focus. The general environment, I think, is still the streetscape.